Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today we talk about The Wizard of Oz and the two readings that I assigned for the week, the introduction of sound and the triumph of the Hollywood studio system. So I wanted to spend maybe a little bit more time on the film today than we have on some of the previous films this semester, just so I could point out several of the technical innovations. This is a movie that's very familiar to a lot of American viewers. I'm guessing that many of you have probably seen it before. Maybe you saw it when you were a kid. Maybe it's been a while. It's certainly worth revisiting even if you have seen it before. But a lot of critics point this out. It's an interesting thing to mention when you get into the movie is a lot of people know this movie, right? A lot of people are familiar with the basic plot, the characters, some of the the major thematic material. It's all pretty familiar. It's been covered pretty well by now. But a lot of scholars will point out that even when they get students to maybe read the original book, which we're often a lot less familiar with, or even if we're maybe watching different versions of the story, because there have been other movie adaptations, there have been stage adaptations. It really lives on in a lot of different forms. But even if we're reading the book or watching some other version of this particular narrative, we always come back to this 1939 film. It really is our touchstone when we're thinking about this story or really anything related to The Wizard of Oz. We always come back to the movie. One professor writes about how he's, teaching the book. He's getting his students to read the book, but their way of understanding the book, their way of discussing the book, their way of sort of conceptualizing what's going on in the book is all based on the movie. They've all seen the movie, and they're all sort of returning to it as the ultimate reference point whenever this subject matter comes up. So with that being said, we know that to be true, but I think part of the problem that comes along with something that's so familiar is we tend to maybe not interpret it as much because we sort of take it for granted. We're not as inclined to analyze it or to appreciate its innovative qualities. Because to us, of course, the movie feels rather old. We probably associate it with a very old, a much older, sort of different time period. And a lot of the innovations when it comes to camera work or special effects are so familiar now, or they're even more advanced. We see them a lot, so we tend to take them for granted. We might not appreciate just how novel they were at the end of the 1930s and just how difficult it was to pull some of this stuff off. Some of the visual effects, as we'll talk about today, were actually very difficult, both from a sort of technological standpoint. They were new, but also in many cases they were dangerous for the performers because not all of the technology had been fully ironed out. Certain safety procedures had not fully been developed. So there was a lot of innovation, a lot of excitement, but as the book points out, the advent of sound also brings about sort of a certain amount of instability, at least initially. So last week we were talking about the sort of glory days of the silent film and how by the end of the 1920s, silent films had become respected art forms, but also big business, both here in America and in much of the rest of the world. But the quality of the films had, improved a lot since the 19-teens, or certainly compared to what we saw at the very beginning of the semester. So we had really sophisticated narratives. Yeah, we didn't have traditional sound in the way that we would think of it today, but we had those intertitles. We could often read what the characters were saying. So we could still understand character development. We could still understand plot development. And as I was saying last week, a lot of those silent films from the 20s were quite epic. Very large scales. really sort of sophisticated for the time period in terms of how they were filming it, the construction of sets, art direction, organizing all of these extras, all of these performers. So really rapid development, rapid modernization in a lot of ways throughout the 20s, part of that Hollywood studio style, not just in terms of how they were making the movies, but also how the movies looked. Increasingly, they looked like movies kind of look today in terms of the way the cameras were operating, lighting, mise-en-scene, just, the overall visual effect, everything outside of the camera shots, sets, costumes, the way actors moved, starting to look more and more like movies today. But of course, silent films were quite different. They were in black and white. They were silent. They often featured music, but the music would be a live accompaniment. So we talked about different forms of music and how they functioned with silent film last time, but keep a lot of that in mind as we move into the introduction of sound this week, because it's kind of a recurring theme that we're going to notice with movies. Oftentimes, right when the cinema reaches this sort of high point of creative expression, that often means it's right on the verge of big change. So we kind of mentioned this last week. Right as silent film really reaches its peak, artistically, commercially, in terms of popularity, by the end of the 20s, right as it really gets to that peak, we start to see major change because we have the development of sound technology, which fundamentally alters the movie industry. So, that's also going to be kind of true of the studios as well. We're going to see that this week. The studios have been really dominant since the 20s. They continue to be dominant through the end of the 30s. And a lot of people say the real golden era of studio, Hollywood studio filmmaking is the late 30s, because by then we kind of have all the technology in place, right? We have these sophisticated feature-length films. Now we have sound, and as we can see this week with The Wizard of Oz, now we also have color. By the end of the 30s, we have Technicolor. So we've been able to move beyond black and white, although we would continue to have a lot of black and white films throughout the 40s, 50s, and even into the 60s. But we have this new technology, we have sound, we have color, films are a big deal, and sometimes the year 1939 is actually highlighted as maybe like the high water moment, the high water point of Hollywood filmmaking in general. Right? If the late 20s was kind of the peak of the silent film era, the late 30s is really kind of the peak of this classical Hollywood era, as we often think about it. And a lot of really important films came out in 1939. Gone with the Wind was another, The Wizard of Oz, some others too, but just the overall type of like A-level productions that we're seeing by the end of the 30s, these technological advancements, the overall popularity of movies, and then also that business model that's been pioneered by Hollywood, all of that stuff is kind of at peak operating capacity in the late 30s as we enter the 1940s. So that's great, but big change is on the horizon. As you guys know, World War II is right around the corner. So the war, which, our involvement in the war began, late 1941. So the war changes a lot of things for the movie industry, but also, as the book mentions, the U.S. government pursuing antitrust charges against the studios was another thing. Like, they accused the studios of basically monopolizing the film industry, which they largely had done. I mean, I think the government was probably correct, but they found that the studios were actually violating sort of anti-monopoly laws. So that sort of legal crackdown begins right as we enter the 40s. It would take a while for the studios to really get weakened, but within the next 20 years or so, the studios would lose a lot of the control, a lot of this vertical integration that we've been talking about. They would lose that largely because the government kind of stripped them of some of their power. but also the war and the changes that it brought to economics, entertainment and other things also played a part. So the book covers some of that stuff. We'll get into it today, but I really do want to focus on some of the new sound technology, but not just the technology itself, also the larger changes that this new technology brought about. Because as the book says, there were a lot of things about silent cinema, like kind of cool things, distinctive things, that went away as a result of sound. So they kind of start by mentioning music, right? The fact that with the arrival of sound films, you no longer needed those orchestras to play in the theater alongside the film. So we talked about this last week. There were actually several different types of musical accompaniment that one might enjoy along with a silent film. If you were watching the film in one of those big movie palaces, like the Chinese Theater in LA, chances are there was a full orchestra down in the pit, like in between you and the screen, and they would play along with the movie. So you would get music that way. If you were watching in maybe a smaller theater, you didn't live in LA or New York, so you're just going to your sort of local theater, smaller in scale, not as much of a budget, so they might just have a single piano player, or a little bit later on, an organ player to accompany the images on screen. So we talked about that, and in some cases it might just be a single piano player, in a lot of other cases it would be a full band or a full orchestra. So the book talked about that last week, and this week they're sort of talking about how that goes away. Because obviously with sound films, you don't need the live music anymore. So that might not matter a lot to us. We probably prefer sound films, I'm guessing, but the book does point out how many musicians lost their jobs as a result of this, right? There were a lot of movie musicians, who were suddenly out of work because of this new technology. So we lose our movie orchestras, we lose our piano players, but more importantly, in sort of a larger sense, we lose a little bit of the local individuality of silent film. So they talk about this in the book, because you would often have different kinds of live music, and remember, you would also have kind of a larger program. So the movie during the silent era, the movie was the featured attraction, but you would also have little short, like comedy films or little shorts, before the feature film. You might have some local live performers doing sort of an updated vaudeville routine where there might be some singing and dancing or even some comedy. And then you would have the actual movie. But this would vary, right, from place to place. Different theaters would offer different programs. They would offer different music. So the book makes the point that this kind of led to a lot of interesting diversity between different theaters, between different cities. Yeah, they're showing the same movies, but each exhibition of the movie would be a little bit different, right? Because you would have different live entertainment, different forms of music, different kinds of theaters. So this is really emphasizing the exhibition part of the three-part movie process, right? So we talk about production, that's the actual making of the movie, then distribution, that's selling the movie to exhibitors who can then show it to audiences, and then there's exhibition, the actual act of exhibiting the movies for a paying audience. So in the silent days, exhibition was a really big part of it, and exhibition was very heterogeneous, right? It was different in different places. They make the point that the advent of sound makes movies a little bit more homogeneous, because now the exhibition part becomes really uniform. You don't need the live music. You don't need the comedy or the little song and dance numbers before the movie, right? Now it's just the movie. You don't need the orchestra. You don't need the organ player. Everything is contained within the movie. And again, we probably take this for granted because this is our own experience of movies, but it really is a major change. So they talk about this in the book. The film becomes what they call an autonomous, independent work of art. It's a complete package now with sound, and it no longer needs any kind of external accompaniment, whether that comes in the form of a piano player, an orchestra, a comedian. They mention how in other countries there would almost be like narrators. In Japan in particular, they would have a person whose job it was during the silent film to basically narrate it, almost like the narrator in a book, and to sort of clue the audience in to what's going on. Oh, this is very bad news for this character. He was just told that his dog died. That's why he's sad. Sort of providing explanations, providing a sort of play-by-play. And obviously, you didn't need stuff like that anymore with sound film. So this is significant. A lot of theorists and critics were interested in this because, remember, film at this point really hasn't been around all that long, roughly 30 to 40 years. Already a lot's changed about it. In the early days, it was kind of dismissed as mostly just a novelty, not real art. But like the book says, by the 20s, it was art. Some of these silent films, Metropolis, that's art. That's not just some goofy, footage of a family eating a meal or people getting off a train, right? So by the 20s, there was serious scholarship, like serious film theory had come into existence. But a big way that people understood film in the 20s was to understand the sort of interaction that the silent images would have with live musical accompaniment or with live performers who might be, somehow mediating or communicating the film to an audience. So again, exhibition would look different in different parts of the world. It would look different based on the kind of theater that you were in or the type of music that you had. But after sound films come to dominate by the 30s, exhibition's pretty much the same, right? The theaters themselves might look different, but you don't have all of these external factors like the live music, the live performers, other little types of media that might get incorporated, like little stage performances or other short films. You would still sometimes have newsreels or other shorts that would kind of serve as like previews today, right? You would watch those before the movie actually started, but it was still all kind of this self-contained film product where everything that you needed to enjoy the film could be found within the film, right? The music was coming from the film and it would travel wherever you went. So wherever you watched the film, the exhibition of the film would more or less be the same. This might not matter a lot to us, or we might think that's progress, that's good, but at the time, some scholars and critics were very troubled by it, and they were like, oh man, movies are never going to be the same. And one thing I mentioned last week, a lot of performers, even some directors, cinematographers, people who were very involved in the silent film era, some of them didn't want any part in sound, right? They didn't want to make sound movies. And some actors were discovered to not have great voices, or the effect that they could pull off in a silent film was kind of compromised when you actually heard them talk. So a lot of acting careers ended with the advent of sound. Many directing careers also ended. Even some scholars at the time refused to watch sound movies. They were like, no, we like traditional movies. And for them, traditional movies were silent with some kind of live music. And again, they could make a lot of interesting sort of observations and discoveries about the interplay or the interaction between the music and the other stuff and the movie. But now everything was contained within the movie. So it did sort of change the way that people talked about movies. It changed our vocabulary when it comes to movies. This technology introduced a lot of new concepts that had not previously existed. So we needed new terminology, we needed new ideas and new ways to talk about this stuff in order to sort of fully account for this marriage between sound and image. Now they're sort of wrapped up together. Before, they used to be kind of separate. So just understand that sort of major transition, that major change that occurs during this time. So the book mentions that by 1930, pretty much all American films were wired for sound. And silent films, at least in this country, pretty much stopped getting made. Now, it is worth mentioning that in some other countries, you would have more silent film production, at least throughout the 30s. But typically by the 40s, by the middle of the century, everything's sound. So if you guys are interested in some of this history, the book does a nice job of walking you through some of the early attempts to create sound movies. We don't have to rehash all of that, but they had been sort of experimenting with different ways to incorporate sound. But some of those early efforts back in the 20s really didn't result in like the modern use of sound the way we would think of it. Like they mentioned the film Don Juan, which came out in 1926. It had sound, but it's still mostly considered a silent film because there was no dialogue. And the sound was really just sort of meant to synchronize with the images. These were kind of early primitive attempts. We still couldn't hear the characters talk, right? But there was sound embedded within the film. And then 1 year later, in 1927, we have The Jazz Singer, which is typically credited as the first sound film in the US. But again, it's kind of debatable as to whether it's a full sound movie. I mean, there is some dialogue, but as they mentioned in the book, they mostly just use lip sync recordings of songs and a few little snippets of dialogue. So it's mostly just a silent film with a few sound inserts. But it was a trailblazing thing because it sort of proved to producers and studio executives that sound movies could work and that audiences would sort of respond to them positively. So within a few years, the technology really takes over, and again, talking pictures become dominant. But there were several problems, and some of it had to do with the international market. So I don't want to get too much into this, but it is part of the reason Hollywood starts to run into a few roadblocks, at least initially, with the advent of sound. Because one thing to consider is another cool thing about silent movies is you could show the same silent movie throughout the world, right? There really wasn't a language barrier. Now, of course, there would be intertitles, and if you were going to export a movie to other countries, you would need to get those intertitles translated into whatever language of the country it was going to, but that wasn't terribly difficult, and you could do that pretty quickly and cheaply. So silent films could be exported everywhere. Whereas talking movies were different. As the book points out, they were sort of prisoners of their own language, right? So if you have an American movie where the characters are speaking in English and you want to export it to Germany, Italy, France, Japan, India, well, it's going to be hard for them to know what the characters are talking about because it would take a few more years for us to develop subtitles and dubbing technology. So those are the two ways we typically overcome the language barrier when it comes to watching films from other countries, right? You either watch the movie with subtitles or it can be dubbed into your own language. And the book talks about how those two methods kind of developed and dubbing was favored in some places like Italy, whereas subtitles were more popular in other places. But it would take a while for that technology to catch up. So initially, it was hard to export films if they were only in one language, right? Because that would sort of limit the potential audience. But they got the tech to catch up to that. But for a while, that does hurt Hollywood's international exportation of movies. But they kind of get over it. A few other problems that they mention has to do with, well, maybe problems aren't the way to think about it, but just changes. Okay, they had a lot of new things that they had to do, new stuff that they had to build in some cases. They needed soundproof walls on sound stages or sets. Also, older equipment like cameras and lights in the silent era were very loud. Cameras were loud. Lights would often hiss or emit some kind of a noise. Now they really had to silent that equipment because they were going to capture a lot of that on the sound recording. So they had to advance a lot of the technology to make sound work. They had to hire new personnel. Electrical engineers, sound engineers, people who could handle the recording and the mixing. Editing also changed as a result of sound. So a lot of change. And also the importance of the microphone, right? Now the microphone rises in importance, and arguably it's nearly as important as the camera. And it's kind of the equivalent of the camera. The microphone is for the aural senses, right? The sense of sound is to the camera when the camera is capturing that sense of sight. So there's kind of this parallel. Now we can think about visual point of view, which has always been around with movies, along with a sort of aural or audio point of view, where you can feel a certain way based on sound, based on what you're hearing. So again, that's just new. But also they had to sometimes create longer camera shots in order to accommodate dialogue. Again, we take dialogue for granted because almost every movie has some. But remember, in the silent era, you didn't really have to spend a lot of time showing characters talking. I mean, there would be scenes where you could see that characters were talking, and then we would get the intertitles to tell us what they were saying. But those shots were often pretty short because you didn't have to show the entire conversation. We couldn't hear it. So a lot of times it was sort of like a shorthand, like, hey, these people are talking. Here's what they're talking about. And then we're going to go ahead and move ahead in the action. We're going to move on to something a little bit more exciting. But with talking films, you needed to capture the dialogue. You had to capture really that entire conversation. So that meant longer shots. That meant sometimes a slower pace. We mentioned last week, part of the reason silent films could often have such a huge scale. Like, think about the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Think about Metropolis. Those huge scenes with all this action, right? Part of the reason they were able to do that was because they didn't have to capture dialogue. So they could jump around to the action and not worry about spending a couple of minutes letting us listen to two characters talk, right? If you think about it, conversation really does slow things down. So with talking, you had a slower pace, longer shots, but there was also some technological advancement because you had to accommodate sound. So you typically see more camera movement because, again, it can be a little bit boring to just sit there and look at two people talking. So cinematographers and directors started to develop some more techniques for camera mobility. Let's move the camera around a little bit. Also, they started to use more reframings. You might be familiar with that. That just means you're changing a camera angle without a cut. So you're not cutting from one shot to the next. You're staying within a single shot, but you're changing your angle. You're changing your approach or your point of view. And sometimes you might even change the focus. Like going from showing something in the foreground to maybe showing something in the background. Again, we have to get a little bit more creative, a little bit more innovative to make a scene with a bunch of people sitting around and talking interesting to look at. So more camera movement, more reframings, and we're going to start to see the kind of camera movement that we're accustomed to today. A lot of panning, going from side to side, tracking, following characters as they move. You guys have seen a lot of modern examples of tracking shots that are designed to capture a conversation. I know most of you are probably too young for The West Wing, that famous TV show, but it was really famous for having these extended walk and talk sequences where two characters, sometimes more than two, would be like walking through the halls of the White House or whatever, and the camera would follow them and we would hear their conversation. But that sense of movement is kind of fun, and it makes it more interesting. We're kind of watching stuff happen as we're also listening to them talk. So anyway, they started to develop a lot of that technology as a result of sound. So more tracking, more panning, just more camera movement in general, and also a quicker succession of scenes, right? So the shots might be longer, but now we're going to have more compact scenes and sequences to kind of compensate for a slower overall tempo. So in some ways, sound caused us to slow down a little bit. But in order to compensate, we found ways to innovate with camera movement and also with just the construction or structure of individual scenes and sequences, kind of creating a little bit more of a tight, easily followable, more coherent sort of progression because, yeah, it's going to be a little bit slower. So we need to have a more, maybe quicker scenes with more movement to keep people interested. So the book kind of covers a lot of that. And then finally, just to come back to music briefly, one thing to remember, without the live music, now the music that we hear is going to be contained within the film. We know that, but there can be different versions of that. Kind of interesting to think about. Sometimes the music could be considered part of the fictive universe or part of the diegesis, like the fictional world that the movie presents. Sometimes the music is taking place within that world, right? Like they mentioned this in the book. Maybe the characters walk into a bar or a nightclub and there's a band playing. So we're probably hearing the same kind of music that we would have heard from the big band playing in the orchestra, but now it's in the movie and the characters are listening to it as well. Again, that's a fundamental change, right? It's not just the audience hearing it, the characters are hearing it too, and maybe they're commenting upon it. But we can also get what we would consider more like a modern day soundtrack. Like music that takes place in the movie, but it's really only for the audience. Like the characters aren't really aware of it. Like it's not playing in their world. It's like laid over the top of it for the audience. So we can hear the songs, but maybe the characters in the movie don't necessarily hear them. So just notice the difference. Notice when music is sort of existing within the fictive universe versus when it's strictly a part of post-production. It's a part of like editing. They create the soundtrack. They put the music on top of the footage, and it's really just for us to listen to. We still love music in movies, and movies are still very reliant upon music. But of course, the way music operates after 1930 is a lot different than what we've seen before. And then finally, I want to mention screenwriting, because this is one of those important like filmmaking jobs that we've mentioned that I put in my glossary back at the beginning of the semester. And obviously with silent films, we still had screenplays, right? I don't want to overstate this. We still had screenplays. We still needed writers. But now, post-1930, we need writers who can specifically write dialogue, because now we can actually hear characters talk. So initially, they had to import a lot of early screenwriters from Broadway or from the stage, from traditional stage plays. So a lot of early screenwriters had that background, but eventually movie screenwriting would sort of become its own unique art. Still very much based on visuals, but also very much based on dialogue and what characters are saying. Okay. So let's move on to the second reading. Just briefly, I'm guessing you guys aren't like super interested in the era of the studios and like the whole Hollywood business model. We've already covered it pretty well. We're going to talk about it a little bit more today. I'll try to keep it brief, but then in the future, in the weeks to come, we're going to notice the decline of the classic Hollywood studio system, and many historians and scholars will argue that when the studios kind of declined in power, that's when you had this big flourishing of creativity. This is often placed like in the 60s, the 70s, and the movie industry opens up. And you have more independent production. You have more women, people of color, different perspectives getting involved in the movie industry. That's going to come later. We're not talking about that yet, but in order to appreciate those changes, in order to appreciate what's going on in the 60s and 70s, you have to know how dominant the studios were earlier to really appreciate that transition. So that's why I want to return to some of this week, even though some of it might be review. We've already talked about how the studios really rose to dominance in the 20s. They monopolized movie making, and they created this sort of factory model that really prioritized efficiency. They kept everybody under contract. They churned out the movies very quickly. And this business model was then exported to the rest of the world, and it was very influential. So we already know that. By the 30s, like we said, there was a little blip at the beginning of the 30s when Hollywood struggled a bit with the Great Depression, which is, of course, going on throughout the decade. It hits them pretty hard initially, and some of these international problems with translation, with movies in different language, English movies not always selling well, English language movies not always selling well to other countries where they speak other languages. But they got over those problems pretty quickly. So by the mid-30s, they're back in their sort of dominant position, and they would remain there at least until World War II. And then they would start a long decline that we'll cover later. But just to give you a little bit more background, they mentioned the major studios. If you're interested, you can look into these more. I'll just list them for now. There were typically considered like 8 the golden era was really thought of as being dominated by 8 studios, some of which still exist. So Paramount, Fox, Warner Brothers, MGM, RKO, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. Those were the big 8 studios. 5 of them were considered the major studios, and then the last 3 I listed were considered more minor studios. So Universal, Columbia, and United Artists were kind of smaller. And that doesn't matter a whole lot to us, but one thing that does happen, the book mentions early during the Depression, the studios, the big studios, the major ones that had achieved true vertical integration, they actually got hurt a little bit through their theater ownership, because something to do with mortgages and like theaters were losing money early on in the Depression. So the major studios had bought up the theaters, right? That's how they achieved vertical integration, control over production, distribution, and exhibition. The 3 smaller studios, Universal, Columbia, and UA, they didn't actually own any theater chains. They would still sell their movies to exhibitors, theaters, but they didn't actually own the theaters themselves. So that kind of worked to their benefit. They lost less money in the early 30s. But those were the 8 studios, and they pretty much monopolized film production in this country. So one cool thing, and they talk about it a little bit in the book, is like each studio developed sort of their own unique house style. And back then, actors, directors, cinematographers, set designers, pretty much everybody would be under contract to one particular studio. So you'd have a lot of in-house talent that would work on a lot of the movies being put out by a particular studio. So the book uses the example of Warner Brothers. They kind of had their own in-house style, largely based on the actors they had under contract, the directors and other, creatives that they had under contract. They tended to specialize in certain kinds of movies. Gangster movies, westerns, romance, whatever, kind of based on the people they had under contract and the kinds of movies they typically made. So again, I won't spend time going through each studio's house style, but that information's available to you if you're interested. Also, during this time, we have the development of this kind of bifurcated style of making movies where you had big budget, high level A productions versus the cheaper, quicker B movies. And we still kind of have this distinction today. I don't think it matters as much today as it did back then, but you still notice the difference between like maybe a prestige drama, Oscar bait, the kind of movie that's going to win Academy Awards. It has really famous actors, Steven Spielberg or some big shot director is making it. You know the difference between that kind of movie versus like a low budget slasher movie that doesn't play nationwide. Maybe it's direct to video or nowadays direct to streaming. And it still could be a fun movie. You might like it a lot. But clearly, not as much money was spent on it. The actors aren't as famous. The director isn't as famous. It doesn't have as many special effects. The sets aren't as elaborate. You can just tell it was made on a smaller budget. So we still have these distinctions today, and they really came into existence in the 30s. So a lot of the smaller studios, even RKO, which was one of the 5 big ones, but it never had as much money as the other 5 big ones, the other 4, it would specialize in a lot of B movies. The smaller studios like Columbia would specialize in B movies, gangster movies, sort of like action flicks, stuff that they could make on the cheap. They could mass produce them, and they were still pretty popular, even though, they didn't have the prestige, the glossiness, or the big name actors that some of the bigger productions from like Fox or Warner Brothers would have had, or MGM, some of the really richest studios. So anyways, that's interesting if you're interested. You can always find more about the studios. But a big shift that happened, and this is still kind of the way movies get made today. They talk about this in the chapter called The Triumph of the Studio System. We have this move away from what they call the central producer model. In the early days of movies, you would have like 1 or 2 studio executives who would supervise pretty much all productions of a particular studio, right? That was a very centralized, top-down kind of model. And in the 30s, it started to change. We went to what is called unit production, where you have a group of producers in the employ of a studio, and each producer would supervise like 6 to 8 movies a year. And each producer would have their own unit. And again, these would be people that they had worked with before, typically. Directors, actors, but sometimes like art directors, cinematographers, even like camera operators, lighting technicians, grips, makeup artists, costume designers, right? So they would have these kind of self-contained units led by a producer, and they would typically make certain types of movies, right? They would specialize in a particular genre. So the lackey unit might specialize in pirate movies and action-adventure movies. And I work with Errol Flynn, who is sort of a swashbuckling action star of that era. And I have a couple of directors that can really make those movies well. And I have a couple of screenwriters that I really like. And that's my unit. And we typically put out a certain kind of movie. So that became a more successful model, not only because it just kind of worked better, it was, you could kind of disperse a lot of the responsibility and you could get more done at once, but also you had a little bit more creative control within the units, right? Instead of having one person in charge of all production, you had a lot of different voices, different styles. Different units would do things a little bit differently. They would have different talent, again, specialized in different genres. So a lot of scholars argue that the move to this sort of unit-based production would really sort of create just better conditions for creative, art, basically. You would have creative control and administrative control dispersed throughout many different producers. So you would get a little bit more of a range of outcomes. You would still have that real factory model persist with a lot of B movies. And with some of those smaller studios, they would still use the factory model because it was cheaper. They didn't have the kind of resources or budgets to maybe have a lot of different producer units. So you would still see it, but increasingly by the 30s, we're moving to more of that unit production model, which largely still exists today. It's really still how movies get made at major studios. But even though this might have been more conducive to creativity, the book wants us to understand that movies remained just as market-driven and commercially motivated as ever. And they largely remained vertically integrated during this time. Again, just meaning that the studios really controlled all three phases of the filmmaking industry: production, distribution, and exhibition. We also had the formation of more stars, more genres come into popularity during this period. Gangster movies, adventure stories, romance. A lot of them had already existed before, westerns, but now they're becoming sort of standardized, more codified, and they're becoming more immediately recognizable to audiences. But along with that genre formulation, you also have the star formulation. Certain movie stars coming into existence, and a lot of times they would specialize in certain genres, right? So again, that's kind of modern. We still have that today, the creation of these star personas and also the genres that they often appear in. Still very much a part of movie making today. So again, 1939 might have been the real Hollywood golden age high point, the year that Wizard of Oz comes out. But right after 39, we have the antitrust campaign led by the U.S. government against the studios, and we have World War II, and of course they change a lot. So let's wrap up today by talking about the film. I'm not going to spend quite as much time as I had envisioned, but I would like to just point your attention to a few specific places. Just some things that you can revisit, some things that you can analyze further, some things that you could certainly write about and talk about on future assignments. But just a few little background nuggets to give you some context. As I mentioned, this film was based on a book. Most people don't read the book anymore, but it came out in the year 1900. Written by L. Frank Baum. I'm not sure what the L stands for. You should Google him. But anyway, the book was popular when it first came out, and it also spawned a series of sequels. So there were a lot of other Wizard of Oz books that came out after that initial one. And right away, early movie makers wanted to adapt it to the screen. There were actually some earlier film adaptations. Baum himself, in 1913, formed his own film company in Hollywood. And he tried to turn a bunch of his Oz books into movies. But they largely failed. According to the sources, I guess Baum was a better writer than he was a filmmaker. There was also a 1925 silent version of The Wizard of Oz, which was not very financially successful. So they had tried it and failed before to kind of bring this story to the screen. But then in the 30s, the idea of fantasy film became a little bit more mainstream and practical. Now, yeah, we watched Metropolis last week. You might think of that as kind of a fantasy film. It was certainly an early version of sci-fi, but it was also a German film. So, here in America, there was a little bit of resistance to what we would now maybe consider like fantastical stories, stuff that's not strictly realistic, sci-fi, fantasy, other worlds, other times. There was some resistance. Some people were like, yeah, we can't really pull that off. But one big breakthrough in the late 30s was the release of, I believe it was in 37, the release of Walt Disney's first feature-length cartoon movie, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was a big success. This wasn't only a breakthrough for animation, though. It was also a breakthrough for kind of the larger genre of fantasy. Like, hey, fantasy movies can be popular, and not just with kids, right? This could be a potential money-making opportunity. So anyway, MGM, one of the really big rich studios, they buy the rights to The Wizard of Oz by the late 30s, by like 38, and then they start production soon after the film gets released in 39. So I just wanted to mention a few things. The cast, you might be a little bit interested in some of the performers. If you're a movie nerd, you should already know who Judy Garland is. She's a pretty big deal as an actress during this period. She's kind of lived on, though. She had a very troubled career, mostly successful early on. Like, she was very successful as a child actress. So I think they get into a little bit of this in the book. I think they mentioned Garland. There should be a little cutout about her, but you can always read more about her. She had a very troubled life. She, battled drug and alcohol addiction throughout her adult life. A lot of that was probably because of the conditions that she worked under as a child actress. She was constantly forced to diet, change her, bodily appearance. But she kind of made her fame appearing in these sort of kind of family-friendly comedies with a young actor named Andy Rooney, who was was actually kind of an adult by then, but could play a child. I think they were called it was Mickey Rooney was the actor, and the movies were Andy Hardy. That was the character. Andy Hardy was this all-American kid getting into some mischief and having fun, and Judy Garland would play his female buddy who kind of had a crush on him, but I don't think it ever got romantic. So that's how she first kind of became known to filmgoers. And she was, I think, 17 or 18 by the time she made this movie, but they kind of wanted her to seem younger, and that was a recurring feature throughout this time, so they kind of made her wear clothes that would sort of make her seem more childlike. She was very effective in the role. She had a good singing voice as well. So she went on to have a pretty successful career, at least for a while, until her various problems kind of got in the way. But anyway, she remains famous, and some people think of her largely because she had kind of a rough life, a tragic life, but other people largely remember her for some of her, groundbreaking performances. So she plays Dorothy. A lot of the other performers were taken from the stage. They were old, vaudeville, song, and dance guys. So Ray Bolger, who played the Scarecrow, Buddy Ebsen was the original Tin Man. He was later replaced by Jack Haley because Ebsen got sick from the aluminum powder or dust that came from his costume, or the paint that they used as part of his Tin Man costume. So he actually got sick and went to the hospital, and they had to replace him with Jack Haley, this other performer from vaudeville and early musicals. So all of these guys kind of had similar backgrounds. Also Burt Lahr, who plays the Cowardly Lion. All of these guys had started out in vaudeville, where, like I said, you would have these variety shows that often featured singing, dancing, and short comedic routines. So all three of these guys kind of came from that background. They could sing, they could dance, they could do pratfalls and sort of physical comedy. And that was all from kind of an earlier era of entertainment, but a lot of early movie actors did come from vaudeville. That was pretty common. So those were all pretty well-known performers for the time period. Also, the director was Victor Fleming, who's also famous for directing Gone with the Wind, which came out in the same year. There was a lot of turnover with some of these positions. So the original director, I don't even remember who he was, he got replaced early on by George Cukor, another famous director of that era. He did some pretty big movies of that period. The original Little Women movie version, Philadelphia Story, Gaslight with Ingrid Bergman, My Fair Lady with Audrey Hepburn. So he was a big deal. He comes on, but then he leaves. I don't remember why he left the project. I think he went to work on some other movie, and he was replaced by Victor Fleming, who gets credit as the director. But some of the early sequences, some of those black and white scenes on the farm in Kansas were actually directed by King Vidor, who was another important early director. He was big during the silent era, and he did make the transition over to sound film. So he helped to photograph some of those early stuff. some of those early scenes in black and white. They kind of used this special printing method that kind of created that sepia tone that you see in those early scenes. That was something that the MGM lab helped them to create back then. Some other technicians or like creative types that I wanted to acquaint you guys with, though, just to kind of have a better understanding of some of the innovative qualities of the movie. I wanted to mention the cinematographer or the director of photography, this guy named Hal Rawson. But it was such an elaborate film to make, they needed a separate Technicolor cinematographer, this guy named Alan Davey, because Technicolor was still pretty new. It was new technology. And it was pretty hard to pull off in terms of the camera stuff, the photography, because of the vastness of many of their sets. Again, the scale, the scope of the film was quite big. So that posed a lot of challenges when it came to the actual making of the movie. So they had a lot of heat lamps, a lot of lighting sources that were very hot. That made it difficult for the actors and their heavy costumes. They had to use 8 cameras for the filming of the movie. I think that was like half or like a third of the overall Technicolor inventory. They had to use special cameras, and they generally had one camera that was mounted like on a crane, and they would move it around, tracking the subjects in virtually every shot. But they would also use the other cameras to get other angles and other perspectives. So it was just a huge production in terms of the amount of equipment, the amount of manpower, and the amount of technological know-how that sort of went into it. But a couple of sort of unsung heroes, people that you're not going to often read very much about. You'll read about Judy Garland, you'll read about Victor Fleming, but some of the other really important creative forces often go unmentioned because they work at kind of lower levels, but they're still equally important. So I wanted to mention a few of them. The art department in this film was led by Cedric Gibbons. So nowadays we kind of conflate an art director with like a production designer. Sometimes they're two different people. On really big productions, you'll have a production designer on top, and the art director is in charge of the art department, and they answer to the production designer. Back then, it could sometimes be the same person, but the art department includes a lot of people, a lot of painters, skilled craftsmen, a lot of people working together to create sets, create props, costumes, you name it. So the art department's really important here. So Cedric Gibbons was in charge, but underneath him, you had this guy named Arnold Gillespie, who also worked as an art director on some other movies. But in this particular film, he was in charge of all miniatures. And he was also in charge of the projection process and all mechanical effects. So in other words, he was the special effects guy. And he was in charge of creating these miniatures that they really had to rely on for a lot of the shots, for a lot of the scenes. And there was this other guy who worked in the art department named Warren Newcomb. And he headed the matte painting section. So he and his assistants created a lot of the backdrops. A lot of the sets in this movie were simply hand painted. And then they were projected or made to look on a certain scale, like to look bigger than they actually were, but a lot of hand-painted sets. And Newcomb in particular has been singled out at times by some nerds and scholars for creating some of the really indelible, like really memorable images of the movie, what are often referred to as beauty shots. And they're sometimes called Newcomb shots, because they're just images of stuff that he and his painters had created themselves. So an example is when you see Emerald City, like when you see it kind of from a distance, you see the towering buildings kind of looming in the distance as Dorothy and her friends are, following the yellow brick road. That was all Newcomb. That was all Newcomb and his painting crew. And they created that. Also, there were times where the live action was being filmed, but it was sort of being combined with hand-painted sets, and they had a certain sort of process for doing that. But there were several scenes, like an establishing shot of I believe it was the Wicked Witch's castle, if I'm remembering, are complete paintings, right? Like they're just completely done by Newcomb. It was like a 40-inch wide, canvas. There was no live action. It was just a shot of that painting. I can't remember what castle it was, but it was a castle, and that's a Newcomb shot. That's a beauty shot. Also, when they had to create the farm, and they had to create that tornado sequence early in the film, that was largely done with miniatures. So this is mostly what Gillespie and his team were working on. So they created a complete miniature of that Kansas farm. It was like scaled at 3/4 of an inch to a foot or something like that. And it was built on a soundstage, on the MGM lot in Hollywood. And it included everything that you see: the cornfields, the house, the barn, the fences. So to create that cyclone, that tornado, and maybe this isn't interesting to you, but just bear with me for a moment, just to appreciate the innovation, the ingenuity. Gillespie had to create this like 35-foot windsock, and he casted it in thin rubber. And then they built this steel gantry. You guys have probably seen gantries before. They're like kind of bridge-like overhead structures that have like a platform on top. You might see them in construction or like other like maybe like oil drilling. I don't know. They often have that platform for like supporting equipment like a crane or lights, or in the case of a film, obviously you could put a camera up there as well. But they had to build this gantry, and they attached that huge windsock. It was sort of suspended from the gantry. And they rigged up the gantry to move. Or they rigged up the stage, I think. It's like a 200-foot stage. They rigged it up to actually be able to move it. And the top of the windsock was attached to this small little car that was at the bottom of the gantry. And the technicians could operate the car. It was like remote control. They could operate the car, and by doing that, they could make the tornado, the windsock, like seem to be twisting and moving and doing all of these erratic moves. So, kind of cool to think about. We have more advanced technology today. Of course, today, most of that would be done through CGI. Most of it would be done on a computer. But back then, they had to do it all like by hand, which I think is pretty impressive. And they hid the bottom of that funnel into a hidden slot that ran the length of the stage. So just imagine the amount of construction, the amount of equipment, the amount of personnel. And again, not just talking about directors, cinematographers, grips, right? Technicians, guys to actually operate these machines, guys to build and move the sets and stages and to manipulate stuff. It was just a massive, massive undertaking. So they also used that gantry for some of the scenes with the monkeys flying, right? So in many cases, the monkeys were just men wearing monkey costumes, like sort of men of small size, and they were suspended from the gantry by like piano wires, I think. But those wires would often get tangled or break, so many of the monkeys would fall and get hurt. They did have like, pads and, like safety nets, but it was still pretty dangerous. And then in other cases, the monkeys would once again be miniatures, and they would be shot or projected in a certain way to make them seem like they were full-sized. Another cool moment of innovation that Gillespie was involved in, again, Gillespie is like in charge of the miniatures and the special effects, but he also was called upon to do that scene in the poison poppy field, where he had to move the camera along the ground that was like surrounded by flowers. So he created a track made of like tubing, and then he created this special dolly that had like runners on it, so it could go on top of the tracks. And that's how they moved the camera smoothly back and forth to follow the action. That became kind of an industry standard, right? Having those kinds of tracks and dollies so you could have those tracking shots and move the camera around a lot. We see that all the time now. but he helped to invent some of those techniques. Okay, so let's wrap it up. The film, they finished production in March of 1939 after 5 months of filming. The final cost was near $3 million, which is nothing for a big blockbuster today, but back then that was a lot of money. It had a very successful run when it first played in theaters. A lot of the critics did not like it, but audiences responded very favorably. They also liked some of the music, some of the songs composed specifically for the movie, performed in the movie. Those became popular. Again, so music remains important, even though it works differently. So the songs were popular, the characters were popular, people thought it was funny, uplifting. Remember, it comes out near the end of the Depression. So if you're thinking about thematic material, right, there's a certain hopeful optimism that people probably needed after a long, hard decade of economic, deprivation. And there's generally considered to be kind of a timeless appeal at work with this movie. Audiences from different eras, different backgrounds, different generations tend to respond to it pretty favorably. Let's try to find some of the reasons why. That's one of the things we can do in this week's discussion post. What makes this movie somewhat timeless? You can focus on some of the technical achievements that I've been talking about, but you can also focus more on the literary elements, the characters, the themes, the plot. What makes this movie appeal to such a broad audience, even after all this time? Okay, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions or problems, and I will see you next week.